Hello. So, it's been a minute or two since my last review, and the fact that I haven't posted anything on YouTube for very much over Christmas has got nothing to do with me reading, because of course I have still been reading, I just haven't been reviewing. So one of the things I've been reading is Larry Niven's Ringworld. I'm not doing a review on that because I did a very fun buddy read and discussion with Ira over on SF Words of Wonder. He'll be posting that sometime soon, and I'll post a link when it arrives. Great book. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm not saying that you can't criticize it, but still I found it very enjoyable. And today's review is not for that book. Today's review is for Drinking Sapphire Wine, including Don't Bite the Sun by Tanith Lee. Now, I've got a Hamlin edition that has combined what are meant to be two books out of a duology, if you will. Don't Bite the Sun, which is in smaller title down there, is actually the number one, whereas Drinking Sapphire Wine was the second in this duology, which they're calling the 4B duology. At some stage, Tanith intended it to be a trilogy, but I don't think I'm pretty sure the third one was never written. Now, what you see before you is the Hamlin edition, which combines the two, which were published separately, and they're meant to be standalones. I personally think that Drinking Sapphire Wine would not work as a standalone at all. Don't Bite the Sun would, but Drinking Sapphire Wine is very much the conclusion to the first one. Okay, my Hamlin edition, which is a nice little edition, though it is very well read, as you can tell, and it's in poor condition. Combining the two stories is great. The cover art is pretty good. Now, this book doesn't actually credit it, but I do believe that the cover art is by Peter Goodfellow. He was an English artist. He did a lot of artwork for covers. I don't mind it. I'm a little bit sad over the fact that when I found this book, this single volume that incorporated both books, I got rid of the one I used to have. And I really loved the artwork on that one. This artwork is okay, but nothing special in my opinion. It's good in itself, it's not as good as the other one. And now I can't find the artwork on my original copy anyway. So, Tanith Lee. Tanith Lee was an amazing and fascinating English author. And I've got a lot of her work. I've read a lot of her work. She's known for a whole range of things. She did fantasy, she did horror, she combined the two. She did some mythic stuff. She did some things, especially toward the end of her life, that were just pure literature. She did young adult, she did kids stuff. She did a whole lot. But to me personally, while I like her writing, I love her writing overall. I've enjoyed most of her books that I've read at the right time. Her writing can be difficult. It can be very demanding of the reader, and I have to be in the mood. She is totally a mood author for me. If I start trying to read one of her books when I'm in the mood for something else, there's no way I will get into it. It's too specific and too demanding. If an author can be demanding, she sure is. And of all her types, I like her fantasy. Her fantasy horror combined is also good. I'm not so keen on her children's books, and I think some of the young adults maybe aren't entirely my cup of tea. But for me, her science fiction is spectacular. I think science fiction is totally her best writing genre, and I prefer them over anything else. I think there's a few things that she seems to do with her science fiction, of which Don't Bite the Sun was one of her earlier science fictions, and Drinking Sapphire Wine, 76? I think it was 76. Was it 76? Yes. 1976, Drinking Sapphire Wine slightly after. So in the 70s, when she was writing science fiction, she did a few things that she did nowhere else. Her protagonists, in general, are very limp, shall we say. They don't do much, they're acted upon, they're not actors. In her science fiction, in Don't Bite the Sun and Drinking Sapphire Wine, she's got an incredibly dynamic and incredible force of nature type protagonist with a very strong mind, a strong will. And if she's a misfit, well, I don't mind misfit protagonists. And I've got to say, I don't think Tanith writes anything but. I think every single protagonist of hers that I've ever read was a misfit in one sense or another. But here we've got a very active, very easily engaging to the reader protagonist. So if you've read a lot of her, what are those series, The Knight's Master and Unicorns, Tales from the Flat Earth, and you're not finding your pace with your protagonists, but you want to read Tanith Lee, I would say try her science fiction, Don't Bite the Sun, Silver Metal Lover. All of those have got far stronger protagonists from my point of view. Okay, so plot. What we've got here is a very futuristic society, and it's so futuristic that we actually have no real time scale. I've seen online some people making statements about the time scale, but Tanith herself never makes them. In fact, in the first book, in Don't Bite the Sun, you can go about half the way through before you're even certain we're on Earth. It's so far in the future that it bears nothing in resemblance really with this Earth. Earth is, as far as we know, completely desolate, dry desert over all of it. There's no seas anymore. We won't talk about the possibility of that and Earth surviving. No seas. In the second book, in Drinking Sapphire Wine, we actually hear that the older civilizations drained the seas and drained the land as well. So all we've got are these 3 domes. And I think in the third book that never got written, there was meant to be a 4th one. But in this one, we've got 3 domes, B, Boo, and Bar. And we start in B, where our protagonist lives. And it starts with a real bang, because our protagonist is on the way to visit a friend of hers who is in, what do they call it? It's not rehab, it's kind of like rehabilitation, but they call it something else. Anyway, this friend has just suicided for the 100th and whatever time. And in this very short section where our protagonist is heading to visit them, Tanith very naturally and very organically manages to give us a huge amount of information about this world. Also about the internal landscape of our protagonist, who's moody, unhappy, mopey, emo-ish, everything that we would associate with a teenager, moody, wise. I'm repeating myself by now, aren't I? Sorry, did a night shift. By going to visit this friend, we learn, first of all, about the society that you've got a life stage known as Jang, which is the young people, and then we transition out of Jang into older people. We also learn that among the Jang, there's certain behaviors and slangs, things about them that distinguish them from anyone else, and that the society has pretty much conquered death. So her friend Hergel has suicided, but he does this quite often. A new body is provided when you die, so you're only entitled to one every 30 units, but if you get bored with it, you suicide in some way. And both our protagonists and Hergel and many of their friends have done this many times. And so we very fast learn that there's no he, she in this. And that was a very attractive part of this writing. Our protagonist at the time when the book opens is female, but they've obviously been male many other times. And there's no actual requirement to be even choosing a gender. If you have been recovered after dying, you can sit there in some sort of tank type scenario and design your new body. Hergel is from her circle. A circle is a group of Jangs that associate mostly with themselves, pretty much like the name says. One person in their circle, Hatta, is known for never having anything that much resembles humans. You've got multiple arms, you've got multiple eyes, green scales, red slime. So we learned that there's no actual body acknowledgement it's fluid and you do with it what you like. Though at the time of the opening of this story, our protagonist has been mostly female for a long time, and she designs these gorgeous, stunning bodies, which she lives in until she gets bored with them, and then she generally suicides by drowning in a bubble, and then coming back in a newly designed body that, from our point of view, doesn't seem much different. And this is normal Jane behavior. It's discouraged too often, but it's pretty normal. So we've got these populations of humans living in these 3 domes. Each dome is known for something. B, I'm not quite sure what it's specifically known for. Boo is known as the luxury dome, and it breeds animals that aren't. I've forgotten the word for it. Okay, so what we've got is, and as this structure builds in our heads, I think that me, reading it first time as a teenager, I loved this futuristic society without any halts. I read and reread and reread this book, and I did that for years and then decades. Decades later, I can still read Don't Bite the Sun and enjoy it thoroughly. Drinking Sapphire Wine, I acquired later in life. I don't know it as well this time when I was rereading it. I remembered bits of it, but not ahead of time. So in Don't Bite the Sun, I always know what's about to happen. In Drinking Sapphire Wine, a character would appear, and I hadn't previously remembered that character, but once I met them, I remembered something about what was going to happen. It's well enough written that I can read it that often. This futuristic society is hedonistic. It seems like it's under complete control of robotic. They don't call them AIs, we would call them AIs. And it's a utopian society which has been created on a wild, futuristic version of the 60s and 70s. So written in the 70s. Here we've got a culture of nudity, of excessive sex, though there's protocols to it. But the Jang society, the young people are known to get married for an afternoon, have heaps of sex with a huge number of people. And it's only in the second book that we start to realise how rigid and confined their society really is. Because it sounds as if they can do anything wild and free, but they can't. They have very, very strict parameters on what they can and can't do. But right from the start, our protagonist is an outlaw. She's known for stealing. And early on she steals a pet, which causes havoc throughout the first book, and there's a primary plot pivot which I'm not going to spoil. If you haven't read this book, I think there's an excellent chance that you won't actually get the plot from reading Goodreads or Wikipedia. I think you should go out and read it, and so I won't actually spoil any of those pivotal plot things. Stealing in the society means not saying thank you. That's it. We've got a society with virtually without crime. Suicide isn't a crime, it's committed all the time. Killing has been completely eradicated, but stealing is stealing from the city, not from another person. That's never even touched upon in these books. The city runs on a type of energy, and in the more geothermally active regions like Boo, they get most of their energy from volcanoes and earthquakes and stuff, but B has less. So what they need is vibrations. So when someone's got something, they effuse enthusiastically at the correct terminal. Thank you, thank you, thank you, screaming, shouting, weeping with delight sort of thing. And all that excessive emotion is converted into the energy that runs the city. Our protagonist isn't terribly enthusiastic about anything. She can work herself up into a false frenzy if she absolutely has to, like if she's with someone else who insists she pays. But for the most part, she just steals things if she feels bored or unhappy or for any other reason. So this incredibly hedonistic society, it sounds like a 60s futuristic dream. And to a modern reader, it might feel very antiquated in some senses. And I think perhaps that Tanith Lee did eventually as well, because reading this, I can see a lot of the genesis of Silver Metal Lover and Metallic Love, and they came much later. They came in the 80s. So I think this pseudo-utopia had evolved in her mind by the time she wrote the second one, though they are all science fiction. Now, I was reading somewhere about Don't Bite the Sun, an interesting thing, about Tanith Lee in general. She is considered a feminist writer and a part of the new wave of science fiction, the English new wave of science fiction. And feminism apparently played a considerable role in that. When she wrote the 4Bs, she didn't consider herself a feminist writer, but later on she admitted that those trends contributed significantly towards her writing. Now, I can't remember what I was reading that made this point. It's like the new wave, especially in England, I think, had a fascination with soul-crushing dystopian worlds. But Tanith here did something just that little bit different. She produced a soul-crushing utopia. And that is kind of magnificent in its own right. And the soul-crushing element only really materializes in the second book, in Drinking Sapphire Wine, which is why I think you really need to read them as two parts to one book. So there's so much here. There is a huge amount of technology, including robots, you've got game rooms, you've got virtual reality, and you've got compact computers. In actual fact, each individual, especially in the first book, they've got a bee. A bee is an electronic medium that floats around above their head. They can use it for communication, they can use it to call people. It is essentially a floating mobile phone which can also carry things for you. And this is in the 70s. Mobile phones weren't even a blip on the creator's horizon, but Tanith Lee was already writing them, and she was writing them well. They are a significant plot element. And the interesting thing about the bee is this mechanical, robotic, AI-ish device, which can be reprogrammed as much as they like by the owner. I personally am no good at reprogramming my mobile phone, but I know many people are. Once you leave the city, the bee becomes a boo when you're in a different city, which indicates that bee has a complete communication with the city computers. There's a lot about the computers and the artificial or the quasi-human, quasi-robots that I'm not going to go into. It's a big plot thing, especially in the second one. Okay, so as well as the tech, you've got a huge amount of bioscience here, purely in terms of being able to redesign bodies and the animals that are created. And the inside of the domes is alive with this beautiful, magic, perfect parks and stuff, and underwater things. They've got pills that they can take that will allow them to swim underwater without having to breathe. They've got pills they can take if they go out into the desert, as our protagonist does on an archaeological mission later. The oxygen there is so thin that you can't actually breathe without oxygen pills. The amount of casual throwaway bioscience and technology in this book is phenomenal. If you are a hard sci-fi reader and you need every single thing spelled out with diagrams, this is not for you. But if you're a classic SF reader and you want the concepts thrown out there, the speculation, the speculative fiction, then this is among the tops. And as well as all of those, you've got the social engineering aspect. And I never got the social engineering aspect when I was a teenager, and you can enjoy it perfectly well without doing so. But once you start reading into it and you look at the way the society is constructed and you look at how it is controlled, it's actually quite mesmerizing. And I was, this time, mesmerized. So the Jang, our teenagers who wear transparent clothing with embroidery and have got active and almost alive jewelry and these ridiculous lifestyles, who eat toasted angel food for breakfast. So they're our teenagers, but we find out early on that these teenagers, this stage lasts for, on average, 50 years. And after that, they become an old person, and they can go on as an old person indefinitely or until they get bored with life and they choose personality dissolution. Even then, they don't die, they just have their personality wiped, and then they can come back to life a second time. Now, our protagonist, who remains nameless throughout both these books, is a newer person. It's her first time around, we gather, but is it true or not? Never confirmed. She actually lives with her two makers when this starts. Now, makers are older people. They're allowed to work if they want to, though we find out at the end the work is totally and utterly invented. Robots do everything, and if there's no person there, it doesn't matter, it'll happen anyway. But some of them choose to work or do art or various other things. But it is all ultimately meaningless. You've got this rich utopia that supplies you with all the mind-altering substances you want, all the pleasures, all the enjoyment, but nothing of substance underneath. And it transpires that that is the one thing that is depressing our protagonist above everything else. Having been depressed for some time, she tries different outlets, and her first one is she decides she's not suitable to be Jang anymore. She wants to progress to be an older person. And she basically forces the city robots to test her for that, but she isn't accepted. She's thrown back into the Jang. She tries to throw herself back into the lifestyle and is depressed and unhappy with it. So, what we've got here is a society with no actual active end to life, and the timelessness and the meaningless becomes acute. Reading the first one, I thought it sounded like an awful lot of fun, and the fact that our protagonist wasn't enjoying it, that was fine. People often don't like the place they're born into. I thought it sounded great. As an adult, I see the soul-crushing element a bit better. So, having decided she doesn't want to be Jang anymore, but not being accepted to become an older person, she then decides that what might give her life meaning is to have a child. Now, how do you have a child when gender is completely fluid, reversible, interchangeable, and not even necessary? Well, her two makers, at the time this book starts, are both male, and they're living together in one home which is underwater in a bubble. It sounds marvellous. I want to live in that home, but not in that world. And this is where Tanith's more mystical element, more soulful element comes out. There's always a hefty dose of mysticism in her stories, and I do know some people that don't like that. So, in order to create a new person, you need one maker of one gender to provide a spark which is taken into some sort of crystalline storage. Then you need another maker of the other gender to provide the other spark. The two of them combine and create a completely new human based on the other two. But there's nothing of DNA or genetics about this. This is soul stuff. And we find out in the second book that you've got a certain element of class discrepancy, I suppose you could say, between real humans who have this spark and the quasi-robots who are created just like a human in every single way, but they aren't imbued with that spark. So that's where the mystic element comes in. Now, I don't think it's any spoiler for a book this old to say that we follow our protagonist as she tries to find someone to provide the second spark from the second gender. Why it needs to be from another gender is a bit unclear. I'm not sure that Tanith ever really thought of it. I thought that was just her idea and she accepts it. Anyway, we go with our protagonist on a journey to one of the other domes. That's Boo, still trying to find the spark. And eventually she comes up with the wonderful idea of having herself put into a male body to provide the male spark for her child. And that's when she learns out that two sparks from the same human won't do it. It has to be two. This sends her into a spiral of depression and a lot of misery. She tries to solve it by going on an expedition. And we have these ups and downs to the character, but despite it being a very emotional character with a lot of teenagey type emo-y feels to it, I really love it. I love her when she's being a her. I love her when she's being a him. It's a character whose restless dissatisfaction with life deeply resonated with me as a teenager, and that level of trying to find a place in a society that is clearly not catering for you when you're being told that it provides everything you need increases the dissatisfaction and the anger. So I've actually got quite an angry character. Now, the second book starts off darker and gets darker still after that. So Drinking Sapphire Wine starts out with the utopia failing, and it starts out with our protagonist having designed herself a male body in which he has been for a very long time now. The circle has changed, people have left, people have joined. And the main character in Drinking Sapphire Wine was one that appeared only briefly and peripherally in Don't Bite the Sun, but comes back from their stay on another city, which is when we start to really see the constraints that exist in the society. And I do feel that Tanith Lee was making a commentary about all the free love and drug taking of the 60s, all the hair era, we are opposing society and creating a new one, and we are wild and free. And I think the commentary basically is that any society is going to have people it doesn't work for. Enforcing any type of society is always going to create rebels, because it's always any forced society is going to create people who are misfits within that society. And the second that you have a heavily mechanized society like the 4Bs, you've created a rigidity in which something can easily break. And something does break. Our main character, completely disinterested and dissatisfied with the Jane lifestyle, but having been refused the ability to progress on, has started spending a lot of time in a place that's actively discouraged in the city. It's a library! Perfect for us readers, right? In it, they're reading poetry and history and a whole heap of other things. And this leads to them challenging a guy to a duel. It's a joke and it doesn't happen. That's duel with a D-U-E, where pistols at dawn or sabers, or in this case rapiers. Because even though the person they challenge to a duel takes it as a joke and sneers and goes away, later on they are challenged to a duel. And they go into it knowing that they have to be defeated. After all, being killed isn't death. It just means that you're going to have to go into limbo briefly and program a new body and be put into it. But they've been taking fencing lessons for some time, and a temper takes them over, and they actually end up killing the person who challenged them to a duel. And it's the first murder that this society has seen for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of periods. And it ends up with them being exiled to the desert. And I'm not going to say any more about that, because it's certainly worth reading. But the connection our main character has with the desert and wanting to see it bloom and wanting to escape the the constraining limits of their society is the underlying theme of these books. And while that makes it sound serious, it's actually really, really fun. It's fun seeing someone caught in a benign society that is not so benign for them, and if that sounds a bit sadistic, it's well done. This is one of those examples of Tanith's writing that just sucks me in and keeps me going the whole time, and which I love without really any criticism. I like the dialogue, I like the characters, I love the desert and how Tanith Lee works the desert. Yeah. So how can I conclude this? I've raved about it enough. I'd say read it, but this is not going to be a book for people who can't read in the era it was written, because a 70s book, it's about the 60s and 70s in a way that isn't obvious and isn't spelled out. You have to think back to the 60s and 70s, to all that society that was completely and utterly out of society, was completely and utterly reactive and rebellious, and just imagine if all that rebellion were taken so far forward that it's the norm. What happens to someone who wants something that isn't that rebellion and wants something else? Great book. I'm a little bit sad that the third one never happened, At the end of Drinking Sapphire Wine, we're clearly setting up for something more to happen, but I guess since Tanith Lee is no longer with us, and since no one else can write like Tanith Lee, I think it's just going to be up to our imaginations. Great book. Thanks for watching. Brilliant reread. Will continue rereading it. Do recommend. And if you're not going to read this one, read another good book.